Hey, welcome back, everybody. Nowadays, good graphics and music are pretty much par for the course, but this was not always the case. Not only did music arguably play a larger role in video games before the fancy schmancy special effects of voiceovers, but it was interesting to see how each console had a totally different sound back in the day. A great example is the Sega Genesis's Yamaha YM2612 sound chip, which had a really boomy sound and really brought certain genres like shoot 'em ups, beat 'em ups, and RPGs right to life with an epic feel. Today, I want to analyze 10 games that people will most likely play for the soundtrack. Most of the games on this list are not bad per se, though a couple actually are. It either means that other parts of the game were lacking, or they just have such an amazing soundtrack that they steal the spotlight. Alright, let's listen to some amazing soundtracks. We're starting with the Super Star Wars Trilogy on the Super Nintendo. Now, like many of you, I was obsessed with the Star Wars movies as a kid, so I was beyond excited to play Super Star Wars on the Super Nintendo. One, it was a platformer, which I absolutely adored, and two, it had all the epic Star Wars scenes, like you actually got to blow up the Death Star like Luke did at the end of A New Hope. But those dreams never quite materialized. While the Super Star Wars games are actually far from terrible, they are so difficult, and only players with an extraordinary amount of patience will ever make it beyond Tatooine, Hoth, or I think Endor, whatever the first planet on Return of the Jedi is. However, John Williams' music translates beautifully onto the Super Nintendo. The symphonic pieces absolutely slam, and any fans of the movies will have a really hard time not getting excited to dive into these adventures, even if that is kind of masochistic. All your favorite Star Wars themes are here, and it's really cool to hear the respective pieces of music from each film in their respective games and converted so well to the Super Nintendo. Like, they sound really good. They captured the spirit and the energy of the original tracks from the movies. Unfortunately, I won't be able to appreciate these games much beyond the soundtrack, but that said, these soundtracks show just how well you could capture cinema in old retro games. Mega Man X6. Ugh, I really hate this game. It has mostly the same layout as Mega Man. It promises to continue the epic story of X and Zero. It has more Reploids to kill. It seems like it would be a really good Mega Man, but somehow Mega Man X6 ends up destroying pretty much everything that made the X series great, and in my opinion, gets the dubious honor of potentially being the worst Mega Man game ever made. However, you cannot take away the amazing soundtrack from this game. Everything from the Reploid choice screen to each painful stage that's not at all fun to play screams with all the great Mega Man X glory, probably to cover up the gaping wounds that is the rest of the game. And I want to give special credit to Infinity Maginian's stage for sounding like the best 80s anthem that never existed. And this one truly frustrates me to add on this list because I really do think this has one of the best soundtracks of all the Mega Man X games, and it deserves such a better game to match that soundtrack. Ys Memories of Celcetta, which is basically a remake of Ys 4. Now, all the Ys games have incredible soundtracks, and I actually really enjoy Memories of Celcetta for many reasons. You can even watch my review on it on this very same channel. However, a lot of people seem disappointed with this game, mostly in how low stakes the story is, and just kind of the fact that the gameplay never really evolved beyond something like Ys 8, which I think was released before this game. But I digress, since this is actually a video about music. Now, Ys Memories of Celcetta follows in true Ys tradition, with symphonic suites that are bombastic, epic, and just littered with epic guitar solos. And even if this isn't the best Ys game or the best Ys soundtrack, it really makes this game so much more worth playing. This game is all about exploration, new frontiers, and this game truly captures that. It makes me feel excited to explore, it makes me think of lands fraught with danger, and it brings the sublime to mind. My personal favorite track in this game is Burning Sword, but there's not a bad track in the game, and in my opinion, this soundtrack helps elevate what is a pretty decent action RPG into a very good one. Next, we jump to the Sega Saturn with Sonic R. This was supposed to be a really cool, fast-paced answer to a game like Mario Kart, but the gameplay is pretty janky, and more criminally, it's really, really short. There's just a few levels, and I will say there's quite a bit of exploration in those levels, but still, there's just not enough content in Sonic R to justify it being a great game. But you cannot deny the power of this soundtrack, even if it doesn't really feel like Sonic. What really makes this soundtrack stand out is the fact that the songs all feature vocals done by Teresa Jane Davis. They're catchy, they're cheesy, they're upbeat, and if nothing else, they make you want to pick up the game and play it, because probably for a lot of people, not much else will. The tracks have a very 90s sound, and they're all really fun, with Supersonic Racing being the best of them all. Now, I personally don't think Sonic R is a terrible game, but there is no doubt about it that in 2023, the most standout thing about it is the music. Final Fantasy XIII, but for you guys that like this game, just insert your least favorite Final Fantasy game because they all have really good soundtracks. I do not like Final Fantasy XIII for reasons that have already been covered many times, such as the game having a very linear design, a story that just doesn't quite strike home the way they originally wanted it to, and so on. Now, the thing is that longtime composer Nobuo Uematsu did not contribute to this game, but Masashi Hamauzu channeled pretty much all his energy because the music in this game feels very Final Fantasy. As usual, the soundtrack is really, really eclectic. You got some classic piano pieces such as The Promise, which is the song that gets stuck in my head all the time, and more symphonic epic stuff like The Defiers of Fate. While I do like this soundtrack, I have to admit that it gets a little bit lowered in my Final Fantasy ranking because I just can't connect it with a good experience with the game and the emotions that games like Final Fantasy VII, IX, and Tactics elicited from me. But it's an undeniably good soundtrack, and it does deserve a lot of respect despite being in a kind of controversial Final Fantasy entry. When you think of the NES, you think of a lot of good games, but there were also a lot of weird experimental sequels. Think about a game like Mario II, or Zelda 2, or in this case, we're looking at Castlevania II. It really plays like an unripe Metroidvania game with all the pitfalls of 80s gaming, such as cryptic directions, slow dialogue, and a game that feels just a little bit ahead of its time. Let's just say that. Now, I personally don't really enjoy Castlevania 2, but I really, really respect what it tried to do, and it's possible that we might not have ever gotten a game like Symphony of the Night without the blueprints for Castlevania 2 being put out there. Like most Castlevania games, it has an awesome, awesome soundtrack, and many favorites return like Bloody Tears and Vampire Killer. And I personally really like 8-bit music, and I think a lot of people do, judging by the popularity of chiptunes. And this game has a damn good soundtrack that is haunting, catchy, and just embodies what Castlevania is supposed to be about. Thunder Force 5. Now, all the Thunder Force games are pretty fun, and they all have pretty good soundtracks. And actually, I think Thunder Force 5 is a fine game in itself. It just doesn't quite hold up to Thunder Force 3 or Lightning Force, and it's competing with a lot of Saturn shoot-'em-ups, which might be one of the best shoot-'em-up libraries ever made. So when you think of games like Dodonpachi, Sokyu Gorentai, and Radiant Silvergun, Thunder Force 5 just doesn't quite make the cut for best Saturn shoot-'em-ups. That said, it has one of the most amazing soundtracks ever made in a shoot-'em-up that really benefits from the newfangled CD technology and that powerful Yamaha YMF292 sound chip that is in the Sega Saturn. The soundtrack is full of rich and complex sounds, but let's not mince words here. This soundtrack freaking rocks the house. It's very synth-laden, and the tracks really fit the stages. For example, Stage 2 is a jungle stage, and a track called Beast Jungle plays. There's blistering guitar layered over synths, and an African-inspired drum beat, and it's all catchy, and all just makes you feel so excited and kind of immersed in that level. I would usually pop this in more to hear the tunes, but I would recommend people sticking with Lightning Force overall just because it can be found cheaper, and it's overall a better game. Daytona! Daytona! Yep, it was the masterpiece arcade game from the early 90s, but I think if you're anything like me, a lot of us ended up playing one of the console ports, and probably most people played the original launch version on the Sega Saturn, which was a mess, especially visually. And yes, there are actually other Sega Saturn versions of this game, like the Championship Circuit Edition, which has much better graphics, but sacrifices that for slippery controls, so I guess pick your poison. So I would not say that even these versions are terrible, but it makes it a little bit hard to return to this game. The music in Daytona, though, is pure 90s awesomeness. It feels like a house party with a bunch of beer drinking tan spring breakers, and I think that's actually what the game was kind of going for. The main theme is obviously the true winner, but the whole soundtrack does a really good job of giving you those laid-back American Southern vibes, especially in a place like Florida in the 90s. The entire Wild Arms series. Now, let me just start off by saying that I actually really enjoy the Wild Arms games. I would say they're actually quite good games. I just think the soundtracks in these games is so unique, so fitting of the game style and environment, and let me just explain. Wild Arms, exempting the fourth game, were all about the Wild West vibe. And man, does the soundtrack capture that. There's whistling, rolling acoustic guitars, unique like woodwinds instruments and flutes and stuff, and they really bring the environments to life. And RPGs are a genre where you didn't really hear this kind of soundtrack very often, and it's also a genre where soundtracks really take the center stage, so it was really amazing to hear soundtracks that just kicked butt, but also had a really cool 90s sound that just put you right into the scenes and environments of the games. And the Wild Arms games themselves are fun. They got a decent combat system, they have fun puzzle solving mechanics, and they generally have pretty decent storytelling. But I do think the thing that I remember the most about them is the music. And I'm not sure about everyone else, but the music in Wild Arms is undeniably amazing. Next is Legend of Mana. While I guess this could actually technically be any Mana game, since I do feel like all of those games have amazing aesthetics above all else, Legend of Mana is my personal favorite Mana game, and I think it's probably the most beautiful one ever made. And I think for a lot of people, it's a very quirky game that will either make you love it or hate it. Nevertheless, I do feel like none of the gameplay mechanics on their own really stand out amongst other games in the genre, but when they're all put together, they make for a really interesting, incredible game. But where this game really grabs players is with the aesthetics. Yes, first, the hand-painted graphics are just as lovely as the music, but the music really is otherworldly good, so let's validate that part of the game. Yoko Shimomura truly blows minds with this soundtrack. It's eclectic, balancing piano tracks with ambient masterpieces and rolling synths, and some tracks even have animal sounds, like I remember hearing bird sounds in one of the tracks. And the eclectic soundtrack really truly captures the beauty of each area and the atmosphere that Legend of Mana is trying to convey in a way that other games would just be frankly jealous of. And yes, this is one of the greatest soundtracks ever made, and if you've never played Legend of Mana, you owe it to yourself to try this game just for that aspect alone. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this episode. Let me know though, what game do you think has an amazing soundtrack that steals the show? It can be a good game, a bad game, a decent game, whatever game. Alright guys, please like and subscribe, that really helps. Catch you next time, game on.